Hello, everyone, to week 0 and day 1 of your security consideration. First of all, I just want to say thank you to Andrew Brown for starting the whole free cloud bootcamp. And I'm really excited about sharing security consideration. Just a bit of housekeeping before I start. My name is Ashish, and I am the host of Cloud Security Podcast. Up till a few months ago, I used to be a CISO, and I'm here with the intention of sharing what I've learned over the years of working in cloud security for the past almost 8+ years and helping organizations get into cloud. So I'm looking forward to helping you understand what cloud security is over the next few weeks and months that we work on the Cloud Bootcamp. But also, just wanted to call out that even though this is a pre-recorded session, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in Discord, tag me on it, or feel free to check out Cloud Security Podcast. And if you find any resources that you need more information on, please feel free to reach out. I'm here to help. And if you find this valuable, I would definitely appreciate if you can share it with other people as well. All right, let's get into this. So as you can see, the week 0, we are starting with absolutely 0 foundational pieces. You would have seen what Andrew Brown has shared so far. I'm just going to say Andrew to be easier. And so whatever Andrew's shared so far, I just want to put like a security lens to it, and that's why the security consideration. The first thing I want to start off by talking about this is, let's start with what's the goal of a cybersecurity organization. I just want to have that clear so that it kind of makes sense as we progress in the conversation of how do I apply cloud security? Why do I care about cloud security? Or what are some of the best practices for cloud security? It is important. So as a CISO or a Chief Information Security Officer, your responsibility and your team's responsibility towards the organization is to inform the business of the technical risk that can exist because of an open vulnerability that has not been resolved that potentially can affect the business. That's it. As much as all of us would want to just solve every vulnerability out there, it does not mean you're solving everything in one go. And that also means when it comes to cloud security, on day 1 of working on cloud, you don't have to solve and implement everything that you find as a security best practice. So I want to set that precedence, and I'll let you take that in. I would let you take that in for a second, and now we can get into this, because I just want to set that foundational piece of, you would find guide online that would talk about everything that you should be doing. And some of them make sense, some of them may not make sense. Some of them make sense in the context of the industry and the organization you work in, but no one would tell you, I'm telling you honestly, that you don't need to implement everything. You just need to make sure that the business that you're working with, you are informing them of all the risks that can potentially affect them and how you can help them solve that. So that's the goal, and that's what we get into. All right, now since we have that out of the way, what is cloud security? Because we are assuming that you have done the associate AWS certification, but not many people know what cloud security technique is. The simplest way to put this is, if you have an application or a product or any form of system that you have put into a cloud, whether it's an application service, whatever it may be, as long as it is in the cloud. Now, cybersecurity related to protecting the data in that application is the simplest way to explain what is cloud security. Now, I've got a formal kind of definition which I've given a bit more thought to. You can read that. But the simplest way to explain it is, if you have an application and it is hosted in a cloud environment, then the cybersecurity controls you implement on it to manage the risk on it, that's what cloud security is. That's the simplest definition. Why do I care about cloud security? Now, the reason you would care about cloud security, because it is different to your traditional cybersecurity. It is also something that helps you reduce the impact of a breach. Now, for whatever reason, one of your AWS accounts get compromised, this is the one thing that is going to make sure that you have enough guardrails to not have a huge damage, or the impact of the damage is not as much. It is also the same thing that's going to help protect your application, your network, everything that you use as a service in cloud environment. If potentially compromised, how do you prevent that from leaking data or allowing someone to leave your cloud environment if they haven't been able to get in? That's also what cloud security is. And finally, a lot of people talk about how most problems, or most cybersecurity problems in general, are human problems. And unfortunately, it's the same in cloud. And having some kind of automation, cloud security guardrails, that helps you manage the risk. It helps you manage controls, which can help you manage how many people are allowed access, the right people get access to information that they need to. And finally, keep the bad hackers away. That's pretty much what it does. Now, this is the last slide before we go into the actual practice for the lesson. I would call this out just like cloud security and just like cloud, even though you're part of a free bootcamp that we're running over here, it is worthwhile noting that you would still need to practice. Having a certification would just not be enough. As you can see, as we go through the bootcamp over weeks and weeks, you would realize that a lot of information would be new for the first time. So have some patience. There is a reason why you need to keep practicing. The same way, if you learn how to ride a bike today, a push bike or motorbike or whatever, after a few years of not doing it, if you try hopping onto it, like I used to be pretty good at, let's just say, martial arts. But over the years, my body's gotten stiffer. I can't do the same kind of boxing moves anymore. So I have to restart my journey again. The same applies over here in cloud security and cybersecurity. The challenges, however, that make it even more difficult is because every year there are a lot of services being announced by AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud. Now, sometimes the environments that you may work in may be quite complex. They might be on-premise. There might be multiple cloud environments. The name of the game is to make sure you are ahead of the curve. And at the moment, that's as pretty evident. Hackers are starting to learn cloud as well. And they're even thinking about how they can use AI to get into your environment. So as all of us security people out here, we need, or at least the people who are interested in doing security, and welcome to anyone who has not done security before, and this is your first one. I would say if you are practicing from that mindset, our one goal of being, I guess, keeping the bad hackers away from the environment is the one way to go for this. That's why we need to keep practicing cloud security. All right, enough about that. Let's get into adding an MFA root user. Now, root user is the main account that you would have used to log in into your AWS account. So as part of the prerequisite, you would have created an AWS account, you would have used an email, you would have logged in. Hopefully, you have already put an MFA, so this would be a redundant exercise. But I hope you have. If you haven't, then this would help you follow along and you would be able to add MFA. But one thing I'll call out over here is that the root user is the most powerful user. So having that second layer of protection for that root account using MFA or multi-factor authentication is definitely important. You can use virtual or hardware. That's totally up to you. I normally go for virtual because it makes it easier. And for context, how bad can this be if it was compromised? Essentially, it's like having God level access. For people who may be from a pen testing background in the crowd listening in, it is basically the equivalent of domain admin. So it can that bad. All right, let's get into the lesson. All right, if you're looking at the screen, you already know where I am. But for some reason, if you haven't seen the screen before, in the beginning, when we were doing the setup for the training or the bootcamp, you were asked to go and create a free AWS account. This is the first screen you see when you log in as your root account, which is basically the first user you would have created. Now, since you've logged in, I've already been doing some work on it. That's why you see it here. But usually you might just see all of this and without this, if that makes sense. A couple of good things to call out. In the chat that was going on in Discord, I noticed a lot of people mentioned IAM users and CloudShell. This button over here, this is the CloudShell, which requires, I guess, no credentials. You can just basically start using it. I'm going to close this. I'm not going to use it at my end, but essentially you can use this as a CLI for running your AWS CLI commands. And another thing I would call out is the regions. Just be mindful of what region do you want to operate in and what region do you want to create yourself as a user in. And I guess users are global, but what areas you want to create resources in. My advice is to remain in one region, whatever that region is for yourself. And for the context, for people thinking what is a region, AWS has data centers all across the globe, and these are some of the what are called regions where you can have this. You can manage the region as well if you like, and enable the ones that you don't want people to use, or I guess enable the ones you want to use and disable the ones you don't want to use. But as you can see, some of them are by default enabled and cannot be removed or cannot be made disabled. Enough said about that. This is also the right place to be. So I'm going to start with the first task we had in hand, which was to add an MFA to a root user. Now to do this, if you go to IAM, I probably should mention this as well. You can either click on services if you know the service that you want to, or maybe you don't know the name of the service. You click on these links and go to that service, or you can come over here. I know I'm going for the service named IAM, so I'll just go for IAM, which is my identity and access management. Fairly obvious enough. Now I am looking for my root user, already has an MFA, so I don't have to be worried. But if I was not, I then have to set it up again. But fortunately for me, I have done that under here. So if I go into account, oh, sorry. I want, so I'm going into security credential. I don't know why I said account, but that's my MFA, as was set up 2018 days ago, so which is a good thing. This is my account ID. Hopefully this is a private video, and I'm going to get rid of this account pretty much after the bootcamp. So people would not be able to access it. But normally I would recommend try and hide information about your account ID, because that's unique to you. And for whatever reason, if you had something exposed, people can use that unique ID of your account to create compromise. For example, my hardware token or my MFA virtual token is over here, but I'm just gonna try and resync or remove if you like. You can add more access keys, but I'm not gonna change it. But this is a place where you can add an MFA for your root account user. So the way to go down this is just do that. Click on your root user here and do security credentials, which brings you to this screen, and that's where you do it. So set up your AWS root users MFA, and we'll get back to the next session. Let's talk about creating an organization unit. I probably should have just done the kind of view before. So creating an organization unit is part of a service called AWS Organization. This was not a service that was available in the beginning. For some context, what used to happen in the beginning when people like me started working in cloud in 2009, 2010, essentially at that point in time, there was only option of having one AWS account. And to manage, you probably would not have any more AWS accounts. You would create everything in that AWS account. Now, because of limitations of the number of networks you can create, the number of services you can create into one AWS account, there were a lot of complaints. And eventually, AWS came up with the idea that, hey, I think everyone should have multi-account. By multi-account, what we mean is people have more than one AWS account that they work in, and they use AWS account as the highest level of segregation. What that means is everything that is in one AWS account has no relation or coordination with another AWS account. So if this is Netflix and if this is Amazon Prime, there is nothing connecting the two. Unless they explicitly create a connection between them, there is no connection between them. So that's how segregated a AWS account is. So as you can imagine, a lot of people started using AWS accounts as a way to differentiate their entire environments. Now, as you kind of can imagine, now people started building more AWS accounts because AWS accounts are free. At that point in time, it started becoming quite unmanageable when you have hundreds of AWS accounts and no way to have almost like a governance policy across the entire thing. And that's what leads us to something called organization unit. This is part of a service called organization. And a few things to think about when you go through this part is, and we'll go into this in the demo, one of the reasons why you want to look into this is as you kind of mature yourself in cloud, and when I say you, I mean the enterprise. Going back to the example of you may start with one AWS account, you start adding more AWS accounts, using AWS organization and having everything underneath it. What that means is it helps you manage policies, security policies, as well as cost policies, as well as billing, as well as a lot more other things centralized in one central management account. For context, the root user that you're logged in with when you log in with that email, that is your management account. It is highly recommended that management account should not have any application. It should literally just be used to create the organization unit, and underneath that, you should create all of the accounts inside. Now, as you kind of mature, you kind of find that you can choose to have organization unit as your own business unit name. You can call it HR, finance, or anything else. But a lot more mature organization, they would go down the path of automatically vending AWS accounts. What they do is basically actually worthwhile calling out, because when you would have created the free tier AWS account, it would have taken some time for you to be able to start using the AWS account. It may not have been that instantaneous. But now what people have realized, hey, instead of me literally creating a new AWS account when Ashish wants to create a new AWS account for Cloud Security Podcast, all I need to do is I would collectively manage a list of, I guess, free AWS accounts, because again, there is no cost to it. So you can create as many AWS accounts as you want. So you will maintain a list of AWS accounts, and whenever I need a new AWS account for Cloud Security Podcast, I would just give that away. So Cloud Security Podcast can now request multiple AWS accounts and get access to them instantly. All right. Enough for that. Let's get into the demo. Okay, so in this lesson, we are looking at creating an organization unit. As I mentioned, it is part of something called AWS Organization. So I'm just going to go into AWS Organizations. If you are wondering, this is it. If you're wondering why does it say Z instead of an S for organization, depending on what country you are, and especially if you're not in America, like myself. So for some reason, and for maybe some may say even obvious reasons, because AWS is an American company, all the spellings are in the American English, which is why it's a Z instead of a S. But hey, I'm not going to complain. Now, as you can see, I've already created a couple of organizations, but what you can do over here, this is the screen you come in. There is no cost to use AWS Organization, which is amazing. Now, by default, the account where you have the root user, or the very first account that you have created, which most of you would have created for the first time in this particular class, this is called the management account, because this is the top of the tree, if you want to use that as a word. Now, I have set up an AWS account already. So if I go in there, my root user is, this is my, I guess, my top tier. My root account is under this user account, that's my email, as you can see. And I've joined in 2017. So I've been doing it for some time and using this account for a while. And the AWS tester is my management account. Basically, that's my main account under which. Now, I have set up an organization unit called test with another email, which is another fake email. Now, the way you might see this is you might have to create a organization structure. So you might just have this particular clip over here. And what you can do once you click over here is create a new organization. Now, you can do it by clicking on that, or you can do it what I do is, if I click on this, you probably see nothing is active apart from me exporting an account list. So I can inform people that these are the accounts from AWS that we own, which is a handy feature. It didn't exist, but now it does, which is pretty cool. Or you can search for it over here. Now, if I'm trying to create a new organization unit, depending on where I want to create it, for example, if I click on this, it should now activate the create new button, which is awesome. And I can say my new one is called finance BU, or business unit. And I can tag saying business unit, business unit finance. This is a good habit to have, to tag, because that helps you identify which ones are good, which ones are not bad, or which ones are not managed properly. Now, I can also rename this, because I found out, hey, I'm not experimenting with AWS anymore. I'm actually going to use it for proper purposes. So I might just say, this is my engineering EU. Oh. Now, this is usually the easiest way to do this, but a lot of people prefer doing this another way. If you're trying to scale, what you would realize is, if you ever work for an enterprise which has a large footprint, some of them may use this approach, but some may use the following approach, which might just say, they would say, standby. These are status, account status, standby. I'll explain what they are as we kind of go through this. And what we would say is, we create another one. I'll just make this to make my things easy. I'm just gonna just rename this and say this is a active account. As you can see, the flexibility is there. It takes only a second for it to change, and voila, basically you're kind of going through this really quickly. Now, I would want this to be moved into, that's my business unit. So I want the account inside, sorry. So I want account inside this to move into active account. So the way it would, if you see the way it's going to operate is now I have, so if I do this, I can create another business unit underneath it. It's called engineering BU, and I'm going to add the tag business unit engineering. All right. Cool. And now I have, to confuse myself, I've got two engineering. So I'm going to delete this to clean it up. So as you can see, it's fairly easy to create and organize a organization unit. But why do we want to create this? The reason you want to create this is because in a 2023 environment, what you would find, I only created 2 AWS accounts, but I already have a complex organization unit. Now, a lot of people may choose the path of using a business unit as a way, which we did earlier, where we had engineering, finance, HR. But a better way, especially if you're a bit more of a mature AWS environment, what you would do is you would have an active account pool and you would have a standby account pool. And what they would do is they would leave the management account completely separate. You would not create any resources on this apart from just the organization resources, which is what we're doing at the moment. So this is the only way, or the only reason you would log into this management account is to change the organization unit and add organization SCP, which is the following lesson that's going to come into it as well. And I'm going to stop this here because that's where the SCP is coming in. But one thing I'll call out is, as a mature enterprise, what you would end up doing is you would have a active account as well as a standby account. Now, standby accounts, because when you create an AWS account, as many of you would have noticed, it takes some time for it to be created and provisioned, because if you don't have credit card, you do have credit card, it still takes a while for it to activate. So what a lot of enterprise would do is they would create multiple accounts and leave it under the standby, and say whenever a new business unit comes in our case, it was a engineering BU, and what they would do is they would move an account from here to the engineering BU because that's where the need is now. And then by automation, or how we're going to say it, to the end user, it feels like it just, the account was created in a few minutes. Now, that's how you would operate in the organization unit. This is how the advanced folks do it, but you would find 2 versions out on the, I guess, the real world in a work environment. One would be people would use that to create organization units based on the business units they have, and the other method is to use active standby, or maybe even deprovisioned, like someone needs to clean up an account. You could have a third business unit or third organization unit to say, clean up the account. We just want to, I guess, refresh it, so recycle it, so we can put that back into standby. That's it for this lesson. Let's go to the next topic. Next, we're going to talk about enabling AWS CloudTrail. AWS CloudTrail is the auditing service from AWS, and essentially everything that you do in AWS is going to be recorded in CloudTrail. Actually, I lie. It's not everything. It's basically most API calls in CloudTrail have been put into as an API call in CloudTrail. Now, the reason I say mostly, because recently there was a vulnerability that came out where one of the security researchers that we interviewed on Cloud Security Podcast was able to discover undocumented APIs, and that has been really fascinating. So now I don't use the word that it logs everything, but it's a service that which is used by or which is provided by AWS, and it can also audit mostly everything in your AWS account. So you need this, like for example, you need this to monitor whether your data is, I guess, in the right place, whether you're copying data, because you have an option to do a data sync of where the data traversing. You can also understand the difference between a regional service versus availability zones versus global service. Now, just a 30-second version of this is the fact that the difference between a region and availability zone is the region is, so imagine US East Coast is like a region. Like imagine the entire East Coast is a region. Or if you are someone in Europe, London is a region. Or if you're in Australia or Melbourne or in Sydney is a region. And I think within that, you can have sub networks. So region by itself is a huge network. And within that, you can have availability zone, which is a sub network within a region. Now, the global service concept, when you're using CloudTrail and you're seeing services are being recorded, if you don't record for all regions and all accounts, what you would find is CloudTrail would record only activity in the region that you're operating in. So you know how I said East Coast is a region, and Melbourne, Australia, or Melbourne, sorry, Sydney, Melbourne is a region as well. London is a region. So depending on where AWS has regions, only they would be recorded if they have been turned on. So we'll go through we will go through how do you enable it so that it records from everywhere, but it's worthwhile calling that. Now, CloudTrail is also super important if you are someone who's basically responsible for doing instant response or forensic, because as I said, it's an audit log. Mostly everything that is done on the AWS account, that is all recorded in the CloudTrail. All right, enough talking about this. Let's show you how to enable it. All right, in this lesson, we're talking about enabling the AWS CloudTrail. So I would go back to my CloudTrail. Now, for context, as I've already mentioned, CloudTrail is the auditing service in AWS. And as you can see in my previous class or previous lesson, I was trying to delete organization unit, create, moving accounts. All of that gets recorded over here under my test CloudTrail. Now, you may or may not already have this. So if you don't, you would simply click on create trail, and let's just call it, I don't know, just call it Chat GPT trail, because I've been experimenting with the Chat GPT for a YouTube video. So let's say that. And I want it enabled for all the accounts that I have. Now, bear in mind, this is my management account. So as you can imagine, I have all of them over here. And you can basically see all your accounts that you have under your organization under here that we have created. What we are saying is we want to have CloudTrail enabled at an organization level, like completely for all my accounts. They come in over here in my management account. All right, now I would like to create a new bucket. S3 bucket is the storage service that is provided by AWS. It's a service you can, for lack of a better word, it's the same as a Dropbox for people who have used Dropbox or Google Drive. It's the same thing, and it's called AWS S3 bucket. So we would need to store all the logs that are being created for all the activity that's being done in CloudTrail in some form of S3 bucket, and that's what we're going to create over here. It loves to give it complex names, but I don't normally change it, but you can change to just for the simplicity so I don't confuse myself. I'm just going to add Chat GPT over here. Again, because I'm making a YouTube video on Chat GPT, so I'm like Chat GPT everything. Sweet, that's pretty much it. I'm happy for it to use the same. I'm just going to say that as my KM alias, because we obviously need to encrypt the data that is being used, and customer managed key, which we would cover in a separate lesson. But essentially, KMS is a key management system. You imagine this as your own personal encryption key and decryption key provider. So you can name it, and I'm naming mine AWS CloudTrail GPT. All right, now at this point in time, you have a few optional things you can add. Which is I can just basically say I want it to go into CloudWatch, which I don't really care about. As I mentioned, as a security person, I would, or even as an engineer or a developer, tagging your resources is a great idea. So I'm just going to say audit log, and I'm going to say Chat GPT. Right, I'll do next. Now, this is interesting because you can only choose to have management events. And if you have seen how long I have had the account for, it used to be the only option available. Now we have data and insights. Now, depending on the organization you work for, you may want to use data, especially if you do deal with a lot of data on a day-to-day basis. From an S3 bucket perspective, you probably want to have some kind of trigger or some kind of notification that you can create from it. So this is good to have data events. Insights is like the API calls that are made. Just a reminder, AWS, as much as you see on here on the console, CloudShell API calls or API calls using IAM users is also possible for mostly all things you do here. Basically, every click that I do here can be there could potentially be an API call for it. All right. So keeping that in mind, from a management perspective, we are saying, okay, I want read and write. I want to exclude my KMS activity, and I also want to exclude any data coming from RDS, which is a good idea as well. Now, where do you want the data logs to be collected from? I think I'm going to say S3, but there are all these other options that you can go for. I want all my S3 log events to kind of be selected, right? Insights. Again, I was talking about how many insights, but insights is more like in a management space. I've called out, I want to record API activity for read and write. In my insights, I'm calling out, hey, if this unusually, like, for example, if it's API calls per minute is supposed to be 10,000, I can use this as a metrics to call out that I should be able to go and say, I don't, if it goes over 10,000, then, send me an alert. But because this charges money, I'm going to exclude this for now. And I'm going to exclude the data event as well. But I just wanted to show you as a feature that because there are additional charges for it. I just want a simple CloudTrail service. But again, in an enterprise context, you could go for data and insights as well. And go next. And it just asks you to review what you have put in, ChatGPT, perfect. All right, I've not used those. Now, I before you click on Create Trail, just letting you know, it is going to cost you a bit of money. It does not cost too much, especially if you haven't done much activity, but just worthwhile knowing it does charge into your account like a few cents or something. All right, now I have 2 of them created. As you can see, I have multi-region enabled. It's enabled for all my AWS accounts as well. And that's the end of the lesson. The next page, which is IAM user. So up till now, I'll do a quick recap. We have started the AWS account. We have made sure we have MFA on our root user. We've also made sure we are using organization unit. Now, next we need to talk about identity and access management. Identity and access management, basically people like you and I who have username passwords to log in into Gmail, Dropbox, or any service out there, you basically would have a similar concept in AWS and Azure and Google Cloud. Now, however, the type of users, usually if you were to talk to someone, you're either an administrator with a lot of privileges and a lot of permissions that you can do a lot of things in systems, versus you are just I guess, not an admin. That's pretty much it. So if you're not an admin, you're most likely, I guess, doesn't have enough permission. But at the same time, you could be an admin who is an IAM user, which is what AWS calls their users, or you could be a federated user, or you could be a web token user. And I'm going to go into it as I do the video of the tutorial, but I just want to call it out. That's where identity and access management stands. Now, a few highlights to consider is that there are 3 kinds of users in AWS, and similar in most of the other CSPs as well. The first one being is users like you and I who just have a username and password. We just going to create an IAM user. So at the moment, you have used your root email as well as password to create and function this AWS account. If you have requirements to have more than one employee, which most enterprise level would have thousands of employees, you just need to be very from a perspective that there are 3 kinds of AWS users. The first one just being the obvious one, which is AWS IAM user, and which is what we're talking about over here. But you could also have something called system users. You could have federated users, are users that are just basically federating from your on-premise environment without a password, just by their username, and verifying the open standard that exists for SAML. It would just help you federate in. Now, obviously, if you create the IAM user, I would definitely recommend, so the system user is the one that can be attached to a system. So that's the third kind of IAM user. So a human one, which is basically, I guess, this it's a local version of AWS. Then it's the idea of having the principle of least privilege being applied on when giving the permission or making sure, hey, in the group of people who should have access to, I don't know, Andrew's bootcamp, they should only be the only one that should be able to, I guess, access something. But for that, they need to have MFA enabled. And we'll go into SCP, but essentially what we would like and recommend, similar to a root user, definitely make sure your local IAM user in AWS also has MFA turned on as well. And as you kind of make sure, you kind of just restrict the kind of people who may have access to such sensitive information, because A, I guess it's not their job, but B, it's a bit overwhelming as well, because it does grow into a bigger problem later on. Okay, in this lesson, we are going to create IAM users. As mentioned before, IAM users are one of the three kinds of users you can create in AWS. And I'm just going to search for IAM again, and I found IAM. Once it loads up. All right, now I already have 6 users created. As you can see, it gives you a unique perspective on everything you've done for IAM. So to create an IAM user, I go into users. Now, reminder that I am using my root account at the moment because we're doing a week 0, day 0 setup. But the reason you want to have IAM users is because normal activity should be done through this particular user. You should be using IAM user to log in, and you should be not using your root account on a day-to-day basis. That's also a good security practice. Now, another thing I would call out, this is a service which is a global service. That means it doesn't have a specific region. Everyone gets to have this service. So again, I'm a user. I create add user. Because I've been playing around with ChatGPT, I'm just going to call it ChatGPT user. And I don't want it to have console access because I don't want to set a password, but you can click on it. You can set up an auto-generated password, and it would just be like, it's a good activity, but I would ask you to do a enable console access and put a custom password in, whatever your secret is. Put that in and just go forward. I'm just going to go for an auto-generated password in my context. Now let's go next. You can also set permission boundaries, but we'll probably go into this a bit later. And an easy way to navigate users is to have something like a add user group, and just be able to group them together. But we're not going to do that over here. I'm just going to go next because I don't have any groups at the moment. And because we are doing a free bootcamp, this is just going to be one user primarily used for the purpose of doing what we're doing over here, right? That's pretty much it. Again, add a tag. I'm just going to call it user type is chat GPT. This is going to be helpful because later I'm going to delete the account. So I definitely need this. All right, I've done create user. And now it's going to show me the password for ChatGPT. I would make a note of this. You can download it as a CSV file. So if you don't want to copy it. But now, if you go to that URL, you can simply click on that, and that should paste over here. That works. So if you log out and go to that URL after you have saved the password, you can use a username and password to log in, and that would be your user. Now, I would also call out, if I go find a ChatGPT user, which is backlist, you should also set up MFA for it. It's already calling out that you have console access and you haven't enabled MFA. So you should go into security credentials, and you should assign an MFA device. You can use an app, and you can basically do a setup device over here. Now, similar to a root user, if you are giving yourself admin permission over here, which we'll talk about a bit later in IAM roles, you should make sure you have MFA in it as well. You can also have access keys, which is the same as having your CloudShell credentials, but depending on which lesson you're working on for the bootcamp, you may choose to not have the access key. You can simply use CloudShell, which is the one over here. That's pretty much what I wanted to cover for IAM user. Let's get back into the lessons. Okay, so now since you know how to create an IAM user, let's talk about the next important part in an IAM user's life, which is IAM role. Specifically, IAM role policies and then IAM role by itself is quite different. So for example, there are two types of IAM roles as well as IAM policies. One that is provided by Amazon, and it would just be called AWS managed policies and AWS managed roles. However, it is also important to understand the difference between IAM roles and IAM policy. IAM roles are, the same as permission of what can and cannot be done in the AWS account using IAM role. You can also use that as a way to identify the differentiation between roles and policies. IAM policies can be attached to a group of user. It can be attached to an individual, to an admin role, whereas admin roles by itself tend to just be linked to a service of some sort in AWS. So when you try and create a IAM user, they would specifically try and prompt you in direction of a S3 bucket or any other practice that needs to be perfect. And something that I called out earlier as well, because now we're in the territory of giving permission to other users who are starting, then principles of least privilege is definitely a must when you're trying to build the program across. In this lesson, we'll talk about how to create IAM roles. As mentioned before, you can simply go over here in the search bar, type in IAM, and that should bring up the service name of the service that you're trying to work with. Now, because we're talking about roles, you would find that there are already a lot of roles that have been provided by AWS. Now, in this specific lesson, what we're talking about is using custom roles to your advantage. Now, by default, AWS has a lot of different kinds of roles that you can work with and you can add. However, for the purpose of this particular set, if you look at this, it basically says is IAM role is an identity you can create that has specific permissions with credentials that are valid for a short duration, which for people who know about STS or temporary credentials, definitely look that up. And these kind of roles can be assumed by an entity. By that, what I mean is what I mentioned about the IAM user. You could have a third kind of IAM user that can use this, or you could be a EC2 instance that could use this as well. So depending on how you work with it, you can probably work around a few things. Now, general recommendation for practice is that if you're trying to create roles or policies, they kind of go hand in hand. So there's roles and then there's policies. What I would call out, however, is when you try and create roles in the beginning, try and keep them fairly simple. Now, there are different kinds of roles I can create. This particular one is if you want to include a third party or you want to do cross account, if you want to do a single sign on with another identity provider, you want to create your own custom policy over here if you want to, or you can even use a web identity like the AWS services, Amazon services, and Facebook and Google. For the purpose of this, and to keep it fairly simple, I'm just going to use just that. Oh, sorry, just going to select EC2 for the time being, but because that's the most common service. Now, as you can see over here, there's a lot of policies. These are policies, as I mentioned, which again recommend to create your own custom one. But for the purpose of this, because I'm about to create a uh, admin role, so I'm just going to say admin. Is there something called admin? Nope. Oh, there you go. It's actually there. I found it. I was like, whoa, it does not exist. Okay, so there it is. Now, I am going to add the administrator access. How do I see more of this? There you go. So it says administrator access amplify. Oh, I don't need that. I need this one over here, administrator access. Basically, this provides you access to all AWS services and resources. I'm just going to call this admin role. Remember, I'm just doing chat GPT, so I'm just going to chat GPT. Description allows users to access all AWS services. Now, I am just gonna, I think I should just be able to do a star here. I'm just gonna leave this EC2 as it is. It should be able to do that. I'm gonna add edit over here. Cool. And as always, I'm gonna add a tag. Role chat GPT. All right. So we have that. Now, where is it? Oh, sweet. It's been created. And now if I go into roles, I can see my admin role chat GPT as well, which is technically allows it to go into an EC2, but can also be used to have, I guess, policies assigned to it. Now, this is one way of doing it. You could also have policies, which is probably the better way of looking at it. So, for example, if I was to go back to, like in the class I mentioned, you can talk about read only. So if I do read only, I'm just going to search for the read, maybe that should come up. Policy name. Oh, yeah, read. So there are a lot of read only access services. I think for the context of this particular one, there's something called audit. So I'm just going to go for audit. It is security audit. And this has a lot of services, which is access analyzer. You can basically list a lot of them. This is a great example of a read-only policy. So, or you can even have an audit manager policy as well. However, I'm just going to go for security audit because this is going to be my read-only one. And I'm going to use that to attach to a policy that I know. And I'm going to attach it to a role or a group of users. Now, I know ChatGPT user, I want that to be a read-only user, so I'm going to attach it to that. But I can also attach it to a group of users, which is a pretty great feature. And as you can see, even though I created the admin role, admin policy, I have not attached it to anything because that is a special permission for only special users. So I did not want to give it to everyone. So for the moment, my ChatGPT user, which was created in one of the previous classes, I'm just going to add that as well as the admin role. And yeah, that would be it. So I've attached the policy. Now go attach policy. And now it's going to do some magic. All right, now I'm just going to show you quickly user group. This is being updated. This is my admin user group. Funny enough, I've got all these, if you're a follower of X-Men, you probably know this. I've got all these people as my administrators, and they have an admin permission, but they also have a security audit permission as well. Now, I can choose to remove them because I'm logged in as root user. I can do a lot, but if you were using an IAM user, you maybe have to do different things. Now, another policy that I would recommend is, say, for example, you can have another user group called engineers. And I could say ChatGPT, actually, Emily as well as my test admin user are my engineers. So if I go in, and for these, I'm saying my engineers should be able to access EC2, full access for now for EC2, and create group. So now I've got engineers that are created that have the permission of EC2. They can do everything in EC2, but nothing else. So this is the example that I want to share with you. I normally recommend the use of only 3 types of roles in the beginning that you would create. One is a engineer, which has permission to access services that you would want to. Like, for example, in the following classes, if you're working on using ECS, then instead of choosing EC2, you would search for ECS service and attach the ECS service. If you're looking for administrator, you would create administrator policy as well if you like. Okay, you can attach existing ones. Now, from attaching policy versus role, now a role is specifically used to assign to an entity. It doesn't have to be a user, because if you notice over here, I can attach policies. I can't attach roles. But roles are more meant for services like EC2 instance role or the third kind of user that I was talking about. Policies apply to both a role as a custom role that you've created. So if I go to policies, I should be, I haven't created custom. If I go to roles, I see this role over here. I can attach a policy permission over here. Instead of saying this, I could change this to, I can remove this and I can add a permission, attach a policy for read-only as well. So that's the difference between a user, role, and policy. User is your IAM user. Roles are permissions that can be assigned to an actual resource, a third kind of resource or the third kind of user that I spoke about, basically AWS service, I just kind of rightly called out over here. And then the third kind is a policy, which can be assigned to either a role or a user or a group of users. So you can, the simplest we can also do is you can create another group over here and just call them read only. And I just want that to be, I don't know, if I'm feeling ChatGPT is probably more deserved to be that. And I'm just going to add a read only. Oh, actually, audit is what that's called. So I'm going to add it, audit. Cool. So I would only create 3 groups of users. I'll add them in. Now, as the scale of number of users increase, you might have to work around this and find what other roles you need to have. But the basic principle of least privilege would still apply. That's pretty much what I want to cover in this video and in the demo. I will move on with the lesson. If you have any questions, definitely drop them in or feel free to ask. Before we spoke about SCP as service control policy, that would be really helpful for you to have a sense of governance layer across all the AWS accounts that people have signed up for. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about what they are and how you can apply them. Some handy tips. Again, having an understanding of regional versus availability zone versus global service, the organization, and by that relation, SCP, which is part of organization, both are covered from, I guess, from a policy perspective. And they both would be, yeah, I guess the understanding is depending on what region, what availability zone, global service requirements, you can use SCP to build controls that are facilitating the the audience or your engineers or your developers to be able to adopt the SCP in a way that it is safe. So, and the region between availability and global services would be the fact that, say, for example, if you have AWS SCP, but you are a Australian company that seems to be somehow operating in the US, and to get around it or to be able to make the most of it, you can leave. I guess you can probably find out the service by itself that is being used is a service that is only available in certain regions, or is it available globally? Like an example of a good global service is the, yeah, I guess understand the region. And a good example of global service is IAM, AWS Identity Access Management, even though it says US use case, but it's global. And S3 bucket can be made global as well. Like, so that there's plenty of examples over there for that. Now, the other thing and the last thing I'll probably call out is having an understanding of shared responsibility between the cloud and yourself as to what would be the next step if there was, for whatever reason, there was a crown jewel kind of thing that was basically protected by cybersecurity. Now suddenly there is potential of harm. Where do you reach out? Who do you reach out for? Something like that, with regards to an object. The same applies to a cloud context as well. Shared responsibility is almost like understanding that what you have in front of you is basically something that you have to manage and control, versus you can let us know, can take control as well if you wanted to. All right, let's talk about organization SCPs. Now, the easy part is just to go to search bar and search for SCP, and you can see service control policies. Makes it really easy as under IAM, or it's under organization as well. Now, you can choose the path of either directly going into IAM and then finding a service policy, or you can just go into organization, considering it gets applied into organizations, even though it's classified under. So if you go here in policies, you can see it's called service control policies. And when you click on it, you can see all of these policies over here. Now, these are AWS managed and customer managed ones. Basically, some of them have been created by me, some of them have been provided by Amazon themselves. What you can also do is you can create policies. Now, you may wonder what kind of policies should you create and what would be a good one to create. What you can do is create policy. Now, I do maintain a repo. So if you can, I'm assuming you can see the screen as well. If you just search for me on GitHub, I've got a free repo that I maintain. By the way, this is a free vulnerability for cloud security. If you want to check that out as well. So best practice. Yep. So over here, I've got a folder. The intent with this folder was to have policies which you can apply on day 0. So it has things like restrict root permission, restrict IAM user, prevent people from leaving organization. So once they're in the organization, they should not be able to leave. Deny guard duty changes, deny service security changes. So considering we have not turned on guard duty, or if you have, or if you don't want people to turn on guard duty, or you want to make sure people can only use EC2 instances if they have MFA, you can apply those policies over here. Now, for the context of this and to keep it simple, I'm just going to take the simplest of the policies. This is a YAML file. I'm going to literally, actually, you can do that, or you can just copy raw content, come over here, and I can just remove all of that. File syntax. Oh, it doesn't take YAML over here. Oh, I need to convert YAML to, let's do a YAML to JSON. As you can imagine, my files are all in YAML because that's what the cool kids are doing. But there's an easy way to turn into a JSON as well. So voila, there you go. It works. And this was a policy called prevent leaving organization. Prevent accounts from leaving organization. Now, if you're wondering what's the point of this, imagine if you're in a situation where you are running a production environment which has been compromised. How do you make sure that people just if they take it out of your organization, you basically cannot do anything because none of your SCP policies will apply. So I'm just gonna call it Chat GPT again because everything is Chat GPT for me at the moment because I've been making a YouTube video on it. And yep, clearly it passed the test of filter. If I do create policy, voila, and it's been created over here. Now I can attach this to a account, which is my main account, or I had a couple of accounts which we created over here. Maybe I'll attach to this one. Sweet. You can even attach policy, and it's been attached. Now, I can also choose to detach the policy as well. So I'll just come back over here and I click on it and just say, oh, I don't want to delete the policy. You can go into this edit policy. Yeah, that is okay. Oh, there you go. That's the one. Click on that. I'm going to detach my policy. So that's the word I was looking for. Just keep changing the screens on me. All right. So now it's going to apply to anything. But that's how you would add a SCP or a service control policy, and that's how you would remove it. But you can see examples of how you can expand it to only allowing certain services, preventing abusers, making sure, if I just go back to the example over here, some of the common examples I personally use is you can deny changes to guard duty, deny changes to certain security services. You can add as many as you want. I've already got 3. And MFA for EC2 calls. Like you can see why they would make sense as day 0. Now, this is an open source repository. So if you have some policies that you would like me to add, of course, I would be more than happy to kind of do a PR. If you can do a pull request, as you can see, I would love for it to be added. This is my small collection of SCP that I'm building so that the wider community can also benefit from. But that's pretty much the lesson that I wanted to cover for this. Let's continue the rest of the class. So everything that I've covered so far is basically the tip of the iceberg. I've only mentioned 5 best practices, but there are a lot more. And some of them may relate to IAM, some of them may relate to the organization you're working with. But there are things which are going to cost money, basically, and have a free trial option. Like, for example, AWS Guard Duty, which is a threat detection software or threat detection service, to be precise, by AWS. It is also I guess it's going to cost you money, basically. That's kind of where it's coming from. So if you were to run this personally and you have that free 30-day trial, definitely enable it. I did not, so I did not enable it. Guard Duty is the same as well. Amazon Guard Duty requires you to have certain things turned down and the flow for it. So it definitely is not an exhaustive list of practical things you can find. But I do want to leave you with at least some top 5 practices. And what you would notice if you were to ever Google top 5 cloud security practices or purpose, it would not show you any of this. So I've tried naming them in a way they are kind of in a sequence. So the first one being data protection or resiliency. Every organization would have requirements from hey, this is a confidential data, so-and-so or something or the other, it should be done. Now, in also comes across in the context of compliance for data residency as well. Basically, if I have like a thing somewhere else and I want to move, but my data should technically not leave the country if it doesn't make sense if it leaves the country. So that's where the data protection residency sit. The other one is identity access management with least privilege. We kind of spoke about this before. We had a look at all the IAM services, governance and compliance of AWS services. It's different to if it's definitely important to realize the difference between a shared service which is run by AWS themselves or just putting a tool of your own because you may have specific government requirements from a compliance perspective. But this is also where you will understand the difference between global versus regional services as well. So now, since we have protected our data, classified our data, identified and started creating IAM users with MFA as we did in the previous lesson. Now thinking about for governance for a global perspective, like certain data, like the citizen data of a country. Like for example, a service cannot just take out the Australian data and just basically start working on it. So those are things that you would have to, I guess, see. Last but not least, I think this is probably a crucial one that big, and we're still focusing on day zero, week zero, by the way. We haven't even gone to week one, day one yet. So the way I would explain this global versus regional is that certain policies demand that you should only use services from any of the cloud provider, which are either a blogged of I guess it could just literally be the fact that you're starting today does not mean you may not have the challenge of, like, people using maliciously, but you want to be able to identify. CloudTrail may not give you as much info. So from all of that perspective, it's definitely good to kind of have some kind of a understanding of what's required there. Now, also talking about what's required when some bad hack happens is shared responsibility. Essentially, when there is an incident, and if it's not stemming from AWS side, it basically expects us to fix it. Even though some people may assume that AWS, Microsoft, Apple, or AWS, Microsoft, Google, who are probably the three biggest cloud providers, they are obviously, I guess, working with threat detection. They come up with the understanding that someone needs to be with us to help us understand what can be done, what kind of detection should be executed. So that's that. And the last one being, if for whatever reason you walk in day one and there is also already an incident, so how effectively would you want the include cloud piece to be back in incident response? By when I say come back into it, what I mean is you may already have a incident response playbook where a certain thing happens, like follow these 5 steps, or something that happens, follow these 5 steps. So I wonder if some of that would come into product as well as security, as well as they keep developing it. But in the meanwhile, it is also just a service that you need to be wary of. So keep updating the incident response as you kind of go through this. That's pretty much what I wanted to cover. I would see you in next week's lesson. But if you have any questions, as I mentioned, feel free to drop that in the Discord, tag me in. This will also be available on YouTube later on as well. So if you watch this much later, definitely drop us a comment. Awesome. That's pretty much it. Thank you for your time today. I hope you got some value out of it. If you are, I guess, as excited as I am, I will look forward to seeing you in the next session. Thank you so much for your time.